Welcome to Disclosure with Dr. Stephen Greer. In this episode, we discuss unacknowledged special access programs. Dr. Greer, welcome.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Dr. Greer, what are unacknowledged special access programs?
Yeah, this is confusing to a lot of people, including some of the senior folks in the government I've briefed. Special access projects are ones that you just have to be clear to. You can have a confidential, secret, or top secret clearance, but that isn't what matters. It's what you're cleared to for a special access project. The unacknowledged ones are what the pop culture would call black. They're off the books, they're off the record, and they're hermetically sealed from anyone not in them. So to give you an example, one of my military advisors had been in an unacknowledged special access project. Let's call it USAP for short, so we don't have to keep saying the whole term.
Yeah.
And the way that worked, it was a $2 or $3 billion project. It was off books, black money. There was an admiral who headed it up. And the instructions were he was taken into an underground SCIF, secure communication information facility, and everyone had all their weapons and electronics taken. They went underground. A security officer was the only one with a gun, pulled out the clip, pulled out a button and said, a bullet, and said, "This bullet has your name on it if you tell anyone, including your CO, about this project. It doesn't exist except for the people in this room." That's how those run. So that is how they are structured and maintain very, very strict secrecy. Now, it's beyond just a normal top secret program. The unacknowledged special access projects, which I learned about in the early 90s, are really how you structure both corporate and government programs dealing with a number of issues, but the biggest one, the crown jewel of all the USAPs, are extraterrestrial intelligence, UFOs, the technologies associated with them, the energy systems, propulsion systems.
Wow. Would this be similar to like when you hear these great numbers like $4 trillion missing, $10 trillion missing from the budget? I remember Donald Rumsfeld having to answer to this one time.
The reality of it is we're estimating now it's anywhere from $8 to $20 trillion that have gone into those operations.
Yeah.
Over many, many decades. And a lot of it is of course, from very creative sources of funding. We can get into that. But the structure of it's what's important. Most people don't understand the architecture of secrecy. For example, I briefed an admiral once who knew about USAPs, but the USAPs dealing with the UFO and ET issue, he was denied access to. And when I gave him a document that had the project code names and numbers on them, he looked into it and was basically told he didn't have a need to know. And this guy was the head of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. We'll get to this later. So I think that there's a sort of the public and the media sort of compounds this by acting like the high school civics lesson we have where there's the president, there's the Congress, there's the Supreme Court.
Right.
The commander-in-chief is the president, has all access pass to everything. That's true on most issues. It is not true on the UFO and ET issue and has not been since about 1956 to 59, when President Eisenhower lost control over these operations. And that's when this super top secret program started and pretty much left the president and many senior officials in the government who should know out of the loop.
Wow.
Another example, some directors of the CIA are read into or briefed. Read into means briefed. These projects. For example, George H.W. Bush was. The CIA director I briefed, Woolsey, had not been because they didn't trust him with the information and he hadn't come up through the system. That's how those work. And I got pulled into that world from people who were in those projects back around 1992, 93.
So if these USAPs don't fall under regular government oversight, then who has control over these black budget projects?
Well, these projects are overseen by a committee. You heard about the MJ-12 committee back in the Truman era. There are a number of splinters from that in the last 70 years. The one that's most currently known is MAGIC, the Majority Intelligence Committee. Now, that entity works with a lot of corporate and other folks, and it's transnational. The other thing I need to mention here, these are not U.S. government programs per se. Go and look at the globe from space. There are no boundaries drawn on it saying Russia, China, US. The group that runs these programs is truly transnational, transcends international boundaries. So people think international, UN, State Department. This is kind of more a sub rosa underneath project. And they have representation and operations in most of the significant countries in the world that are advanced enough technologically, financially to be deemed of significance. When I met with Senator John Warner's chief of staff, we knew was a member of this committee with President George H.W. Bush and CI Director Bush. And his chief of staff said, what makes you think the senator isn't part of this? Just flat out, and doesn't know. I said, I know that he does, but he needs to be on the right side of history because this is a criminal enterprise. It is unconstitutional. It is illegal. And we can prove that. If anyone wants to contest this, let's take this to court because we will subpoena the people I have briefed in senior positions who absolutely should have known about these projects who don't. So that's a complete breakdown of the Constitution. But there's a very specific nuance to this particular area, and it's specific to unacknowledged special access projects. And the people who actually control them are not just what we would call government officials. They're in government, they're in corporate, they're in finance, they're in various walks of life. And they work together to sort of maintain the status quo of the way the world runs. And here's why. Back in the 50s, when we hit pay dirt, reverse engineering and studying so-called anti-gravity systems, that, by the way, was mastered in October 1954. Everybody remember that date, October 1954. So all internal combustion engines, surface roads, jets, rockets, public utilities, on, nuclear power plants have not been needed since October 1954. Now that's hundreds of trillions of dollars, literally. So that's the issue, is that it's a macroeconomic problem, it's a strategic problem, and there are a lot of powerful interests who don't want to see all those assets go the way of the dinosaur. Because when this knowledge and with it the technology comes out, so it's a new world. It's like the E.T. said to Colonel Corso, it's a new world if you can take it.
Right.
So we should have taken it in the 50s. We didn't. Now we're facing massive crises in the environment and geopolitically and elsewhere, but it's fixable. And I always tell people, good news is we have the solutions to all these problems. The bad news is they are in unacknowledged projects, and lethal force has been used to keep them secret.
Wow, incredible. It's amazing. I just, at some point, we have to realize that, we've got to just wake up and release these to the general population. I guess that's what your mission here is.
Yes. My main purpose is creating ambassadors to the universe in consciousness and in fact with these civilizations. But to get there, I realized along the way, I kind of got into this effort and started the whole disclosure movement because what I realized was if we make contact with these civilizations, but then covert USAPs shoot them down or do worse things, then we have to do all this together. Excuse the salty language, but when I was sitting with Senator Barry Goldwater, who was the senior senator from Arizona who ran for president in 1964, I was at his home, and Senator Goldwater said, look, it was a goddamn mistake then and a goddamn mistake now that this was ever kept secret. But he told me he was denied access to these projects. And when he asked General Curtis LeMay about it, who was chief of staff of the Air Force and a good friend of his, he said, get me into the Blue Room at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, where all the ET remains and stuff were kept back then. General LeMay turned to him and said, Barry, I can't even get into that area anymore, and if you ever ask me about this again, I will personally see that you are court-martialed out of the Air Force Reserves. I'm sitting in Senator Goldwater's living room, and he's retired from the Senate in his 80s, and I'm going, was he serious? He said, if he was serious, it's a heart attack. And, so in my meetings with all these sort of people all over the world, what I found is that, the sort of conspiracy theories of who is in and who's out and how this runs is always inaccurate. And what I've tried to do is bring some clarity to it, because it's not helpful to paint the whole government or the whole CIA or the whole Pentagon with that brush. It's got to be more detailed. People need to have a more complete understanding of how these projects operate.
So, Dr. Greer, do other countries operate on the same exact premise like what you just described?
Yes, I mean, the system of USAPs is replicated, as I said, transnationally. It's not just a U.S. effort. The center of gravity for it is the United States because of our military power, economic power, technology. But there are corollaries and associates of this operation in all the other countries, including China, Russia, Great Britain, Australia, all around. So in other countries, occasionally you'll see an effort, like in France. The government of France, the Ministry of Defense, wanted to learn to make peaceful contact with the ETs. And they were going forward, Admiral Moran, and it was an admiral and an MD and also a PhD in physics, set this up under President Sarkozy. We went over there, did a CE5 event, amazing what happened, unbelievable. But when the process of that was going on, their ambassador from France, the United States, was approached by an intelligence operative and threatened and told point blank, don't do this. And they said, we're going to do it in France. It's none of your business. And they said, yes, but don't get anywhere near a U.S. asset or you're going to regret it. And it was this back and forth and back and forth. So even though that was coming from a top admiral in the Ministry of Defense of France, he was not read into the unacknowledged operations even in his own country. So that's one of the problems. The same is true in America, by the way. The generals, admirals I met with in this country, if I've met with them, it's usually because they've made an inquiry through channels on this and have been basically told, we're not telling you anything, or lied to.
Right.
And most of them are smart enough to know they're being lied to.
Right. So they haven't fully been briefed, and they
haven't been briefed at all. Not at all.
Wow.
Not fully. Forget it. They can't get. They were not even shown where the washroom is.
Wow, incredible.
In these USAPs.
And so the other countries are basically sometimes are they in collusion or they're all operating individually?
No, they all work cooperatively on this issue. So interestingly, back in the early days, there was they had a tap on my phone. It was when you had landlines, remember the old days?
Oh, yeah.
And I picked up my phone, and they made a mistake and left the hook up to the satellite, and I could hear the control room.
Oh, wow.
And I listened for a minute and heard everyone speaking. It was like a United Nations of different people. And finally, I said, who is this? And a woman came on, very thick foreign accent. I couldn't tell, could have been Middle Eastern. And said, oh my God, it's Mr. Greer. And I was so mad. I said, Dr. Greer to you. But I was irritated then because I didn't like being, surveyed that way. But and it's like Carl Wolf, who our witness, disclosure witness, was at Langley Air Force Base when we were downloading the digital images in 1968 from the moon. And he saw there were old structures and newer structures already there before we landed. And when he saw that, he knew he wasn't supposed to be seeing it. It was a top secret. But he said the area literally was like a UN of people. There were people there from China. Now, this is in the 60s. Russia, other countries, and they're all working in this highly classified SCIF, again, Secure Communication Information Facility, where they were downloading the early digital pictures as the lunar orbiter took pictures around the moon. And those were filtered before they went to the mainstream NASA people. The problem gets to be, how did that develop? Yeah. It developed in the 50s and 60s.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible. So Dr. Greer, let's unpack this just a little bit more, because I think a lot of people really want to know the underlying basis of how this actually works.
Okay, so I think if you want to visualize it this way, it's a very classified, unacknowledged operation that has cells and affiliates in various countries within other countries, corporations, intelligence services, and governments. But again, just like in America, there's not a need to know, in the opinion of the committee running this, for all presidents to know or to know fully what's happening, or senators or oversight. So it's run the same way. You take that and replicate it around the globe. It's just that not every country, for example, there are developing world countries where there would not be a large presence, but there's some, like Brazil. There's a very big facility in Brazil that's related to this. So I think that there are these operations that are in various places. It's coordinated by an international group. And that group is global, but again, the center of gravity is in the United States. So there would be elements of this operating even in China and Russia, but that's not where the center of control is. They are representative in it, but it's where the big powerhouse of technology, reverse engineering has happened, that's really critical, and that is the United States. My understanding from people who worked with Eisenhower that I've spoken with, who were in the White House with him, is that he lost control of it because he wanted to have a rapprochement, a sort of a peaceful relationship with the ETs in the whole nuclear Cold War craziness and go forward as a civilization. The people who benefit mightily from the status quo of the petrodollar system, the oil system, and the weapons, the military-industrial complex, as Eisen called it, didn't want that to happen. So all that evolved, and now we're at 70-some years past, or 60-plus years past when this got totally out of control. And that was why Eisenhower made that famous speech when he left office, the day he left office in 1961.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
And this sort of secrecy, he was talking about extreme secrecy, could be a threat to democracy and our way of life. Now remember, this is a Republican and a 5-star general and a World War II hero. And I also remind people of Senator Inouye, who said there exists a secret government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own funding mechanism that is free from the law and above the law itself. I'm paraphrasing, but you'll see it. It's pretty much exactly that. And he was correct.
Sounds much like the JFK speech about secret societies.
Yes. Yeah. So there's a lot of interest in these programs and representation from other, let's call them non-governmental covert programs, and including corporate. There's a very large representation in this in certain elements of finance and banking, as well as technology. You look at the aerospace industry, Boeing has jets you fly on, but they have an unacknowledged engineering research division. Lockheed Skunk Works, same thing. They're the things you know about, like the old U-2 spy plane and things with jets, and then they're the classified technologies. And it's a hybrid. One thing I want to say, it's sort of a hybrid between governmental and corporate and private interests. And interestingly, if you approach it, say you're an investigator, you're approaching it from a governmental point of view, a corporate entity will say, this is proprietary.
Right, exactly.
If you approach it from a private point of view, that angle, it's a top secret, unacknowledged project you don't have access to. So it's sort of hermetically sealed off, like a silo from other operations. Now, every once in a while, there's someone that I meet who, and this is recent, a man who was in the technology management office of the sub-basement of the Pentagon from 2002 until 2012, who had baseline clearance across 16 of these unacknowledged special access projects. And so he's provided me an enormous amount of intelligence and information on more current operations that I have.
Dr. Greer, a lot of witnesses have come forward to speak to you, and there's one particular witness that you call GA. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, this gentleman approached me, and I referred to him a moment ago, who was in the technology management office. And some of the most amazing information we've received. I've met with him personally, and he wrote me and sent me his badges, proof of who and where he was. And interestingly, it was a man who spent his career in the military, retired, never had heard of a unacknowledged special access project, then got recruited as a civilian. And when he was taken into that civilian role, he was read into these projects because he was part of the criminal investigative division and had to do a investigation into a security breach. And there was a general, 3-star, who took an unauthorized girlfriend into a skiff near Fort Sill in Lawton, Oklahoma. And there's an underground base there, what's called a DUM, Deep Underground Military Base facility, where they were studying the cloaking mechanism of an ET craft there. This woman was an executive with Booz Allen Hamilton and wanted to get the contract to further that research. So, but she wasn't cleared to that level. And so the general took his paramour in, and it became a big problem because, in his romantic association, she sort of convinced him to take her in so that her company could get a leg up on the contracting bid on this. What happened in the course of his investigation is that he had to get read into a whole lot of those different places. And that ended up being, baseline clearance, they call it, across 16 of these unacknowledged special access projects. So that took him to other facilities. For example, there was a craft that was downed by our electronic weapons systems outside Seoul in the mountains of Korea. That craft was so huge, they had to dig out a whole huge hollowed out area of a mountain to create its own skiff. And that's still there with this craft in it. And then, probably the most disturbing thing he told me, which is something I already knew about, but he gave me more details. And he was in the theater of operations for the invasion and war with Iraq. And there was a satellite system that they could switch on, and it would basically target a volume of airspace above Iraq. And we would clear all of our allied helicopters, jets out of the area, switch the system on, and every one of Saddam Hussein's jets and helicopters would drop to the ground, completely disabled. That was when we first went into the Iraq War in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
He was there more recently, before he left that command, at the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, and where there was another major generation of those. And so this is dangerous because you have unacknowledged special access projects that could hit the button on something and cause all kinds of havoc, and things that would be made to look alien.
Yeah.
All right, so this is the key thing he was telling me. Now, I have dozens of people who've been in these interagency committees or across these USAPs who told me about what this is, and that's been an operational plan since the 60s.
So, Dr. Greer, talking about the secrecy now, you had mentioned a rogue group in the Pentagon. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, well, that's, of course, the unacknowledged special access projects are all rogue, and they're all illegal. Now, people say, what's the foundation of you saying this? I've taken many meetings with senior military officials. One of them was Admiral Tom Wilson. I did do a briefing at the Pentagon. It was a stand-up formal briefing in the Admiral's office and conference area. And he was the head of intelligence, Joint Chiefs of Staff. So this is not just any old, admiral. And but this is someone who would have been the head of intelligence and putting intelligence briefings together for the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Pentagon. He received from us a document, a briefing document, and one of the documents, the first document on the top, is a National Reconnaissance Office document that is not declassified, but I got a copy of it, and it lists the project code names and numbers. Based on that, he recognized, he thought, one, and contacted them, and then contacted some offices in the Pentagon. And basically what he was told was, you don't have a need to know, and we're not going to tell you. And he persisted, and he was threatened with being demoted, taking a star taken off his lapel. But the admiral was very, laser focused. At the end of it, I said, we really need your help.
Yeah.
And he said, well, who else has run into this wall of secrecy and been threatened the way I was? I said, well, the CIA director, the president, the Secretary of Defense. He said, I said, yes. Gordon Cooper, who was, a famous astronaut who had one of these craft land out at Edwards back in '56 and got film footage from his crew and flew it back on a general's plane, was asked by Secretary of Defense Cohen. Now, how do I know this? Because Gordon Cooper and I presented to a think tank together, and he pulled me aside. He says, look, the Secretary of Defense asked me to give him all the actionable intelligence, every little granular detail about that event, so he could find that evidence. And so he did. And the Secretary of Defense got back to him, Secretary of Defense Cohen said, this thing has disappeared. I don't have access to it. It's in a project I have no access to. Secretary of Defense. So I said this to the Admiral Wilson, and he says, "Oh my God." And I said, "Well," he says, "then what can I do?"
Right.
I said, "Well, we need you to help lead up." He says, "I can't." And the Admiral said, "What I've learned since I got this initial information from you is that the best thing I know about is a B-2 stealth bomber. And these unacknowledged special access projects have things that can do circles around it." He did like this. And he says, "I'm outgunned, it's point, set, match." But that's what happened. And you multiply that times dozens and dozens of times that I've been in meetings like that. When I met years ago with General Odom, director of the National Security Agency, his right-hand guy, he described something to me called a DDT. Everybody thinks, oh, pesticides.
Right.
No, it stands for you set up a decoy and distract the public, and then you trash it. He says, we run DDTs all the time on this subject.
Wow.
Yeah. So almost everything out there in the public space on the UFO subject is a DDT.
And so with all of this going on, what can we take away from this? How does this negativity that they put out there, or how does these DDTs or this disinformation, how does it affect us, and how can it make us better? What can we learn from this?
Well, these operations serve two purposes, and this is the sort of the key of counterintelligence and putting out disinformation. And that is, you want to do two things, and this is what they're doing. They want to put out enough information that it seems plausible, and then surround it with unbelievable amounts of false information or a false narrative. But of course, when they began to release information, like the Tic Tac, it turned out, of course, that's one of the Lockheed Skunk Works objects, not extraterrestrial. We know how those are engineered. It's based on an ET object. But that was released, and of course, because they said so, and they're in the intelligence community, the media covered it. Disclosure Project has much more amazing dispositive evidence in that. But they won't cover what we're doing because we're going to say, yes, that one is extraterrestrial, that one is from the Lockheed Skunk Works, and if that gets disclosed, it's the end of oil.
Right.
It's the end of the petrodollar. It's a lot. So they sanitize out anyone who actually, frankly, if they're going to tell the truth, they're not going to be in the mainstream media. What really happens is that the intelligence community will open the doors to certain information coming out, but then attach to it the narrative. And the narrative in that case is it's a national security threat, or they're swarming our destroyers, or what have you. And the reason for that, long term, it's been a 70-year defense strategy plan that people on my team have seen. And that is, what Werner von Braun said to Carol Rosin before he died, that they would play this last card, which would be an alien threat to try to unite the world militarily, instead of in peace, in conflict. And now, we predicted this in the 90s. Now you're seeing it actually unfold before our very eyes in the media. So I think these DDT operations happen all the time. Most of the people who are going to be giving information to the media have looking through a glass very dimly, or are operatives who have been on the payroll to say, we don't know what these are. You'll notice, for example, they'll say, we don't know what these are. They came up with this new term, UAP.
UAP.
They always make up a new acronym that's a lie, basically. But they do know what they are. They know that there are two types. And I have a letter from the head of the Lockheed Skunk Works that we can show, signed by him, dated 1986. A friend of his wrote and said, are these UFOs ours, man-made, or extraterrestrial? And Ben Rich writes back, they're both. So that's been known for decades, since the 40s and 50s. And yet you have these people saying, gosh, we don't know what they are. We need more money to study them. Right, we've already spent trillions studying it. So that's all a dog and pony show. And I think the takeaway for the public really is be very skeptical, be cautious. I'm trying the best we can as an unfunded volunteer effort to do the best we can. But over the years, I've had over 980 of these top secret witnesses come to me. So we have a lot of information archived, but ultimately the things you're going to see pushed onto the internet, pushed onto the tech platforms, pushed through the media are going to be curated,
Right.
And cherry picked to have that effect. It'll be part information,
Right.
part disinformation, and with this spin of it always being a threat.
Right.
Yeah.
Generate the fear.
Yeah. And that's the big plan. That's the big picture from standing way out.
Makes a lot of sense to me.
And then you just fill in the dots as it comes out. Once you know the template, you can get the picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Greer.
Thank you.
I'm Billy Carson. Thank you for watching Disclosure with Dr. Stephen Greer.